Before we get started today, there's something you probably noticed, is that the name of the game has changed again. So it turns out that there's actually a game on Steam called Lumino City, spelled pretty much the same way I had Luminos spelled. So I didn't want to screw with that, especially since it was a recent game. Like, I'd be more confident with my original name Luminous than I would be with Luminos, given what I discovered there. So I decided, screw it, I'm going to go for something completely different with the name here. And so the name I decided on was Soluminite. This is actually a pretty fortunate change, because I was having trouble figuring out what I was going to call the upgrades that you would get after defeating the bosses, and it occurred to me that the bosses could drop a special material that performs the upgrades that's called Soluminite, and that the very final boss is actually a core that's just this massive mass of this really special substance. So I think that's going to be an interesting change. I've done my checks, like Google search brought up virtually nothing. Like, the only thing even close is like Luminite from Terraria, and that's just a material in that game, not the name of the game or anything, so I think I'm good here. Anywho, so today I decided that I wanted to work on the font. Now, this is an interesting thing for me, because a lot of people, when they're making an indie game, they tend to use a font that already exists, either a system font or a free font that they can find online that's also free for commercial usage. But in my case, I like to make my own fonts, and there's some pros and cons to doing this. Now, right now, what I'm doing is I'm just trying to make the basic letters at the moment here in Deluxe Paint 2e. I wanted to get a basic start on the font, because there's a lot of work that goes into it. It's actually not that hard once you know how to do it. But the other thing too is that I've kind of been doing my own fonts for my games since forever, basically. Like, I mean, this is something that I kind of expect to have to do, and so I always keep my own font designs in mind whenever I'm coming up with a game idea. Now, for anyone who's just getting started in making games, I kind of don't recommend using your own font, because it can be a lot of work to put a font together. But using an existing font, specifically a TrueType font that's already included with the system, that's actually a pretty simple thing to do. In fact, most game engines and even some SDKs will already have the functions built in for making your own, well, not making your own font, but for loading a font that already exists. And then you could just load it at whatever size you need it at and just use it immediately without any sort of hassle or anything. One of the other advantages to using a pre-existing font is that you don't have to worry so much about multilingualism. A lot of fonts that are out there already have all the characters necessary for doing languages that have lots more to worry about than just English. But like, I mean, the thing is that when you're making your own font, it helps to personalize your game in a sense. Like, I mean, the reason why I do it is because I want to have total control over where my letters are going to be positioned and what they're going to look like and how they tie in with the look of the game. But by doing that, I'm also limiting myself as to what languages the font's going to be able to render based on what characters I put into the font. Another drawback to making your own font as well is that you won't be able to resize it so easily. Like, I mean, you could develop it in such a way that you would have multiple sizes for it, but when you're doing a raster type font, it's not easy to scale it. Like, you could scale it in whatever engine you're using, but then you're going to get aliasing if you're scaling it up. And if you're scaling it down, you may still end up with strange artifacts as it tries to render between the pixels in a sense. Though one of the neat tricks you're seeing me do here is that when you're using a DOS program, and even a Windows program, if you hold Alt and then push the num keys, like the number pad keys, you can actually type in the exact character number you want, and it'll show up when you release the Alt button. So by doing that, you can actually bring up all of the standard ASCII characters from 32 to 127. Or in this case, 126, because 127 generally doesn't show up properly. Also keep in mind that you need a space character as well. The space character is actually 32, or 20 in hexadecimal. So when you're doing a raster font, you got to make sure you have a space character. Or sometimes, depending on the engine you're using, you might not actually use a space character, but you would actually tell the engine what the spacing is supposed to be. So it's going to vary depending on which engine you're using. Now, one of the decisions I had to make with this font is, do I want lowercase letters or not? And I ultimately decided that I was going to skip on the lowercase letters. There's not actually going to be a lot of text in the game, so there doesn't really need to be a necessity for the lowercase characters, especially given the sort of retro theme we're going for with this game. And I should mention too that if you do decide to use a pre-existing font, you pretty much have to stick with a system font or make sure you find one that's free to use in a commercial product. A lot of fonts are not free to use in commercial products, so you got to be careful about that. So you may have also noticed that I'm actually doing a sort of narrow font here as well, but it's mostly numerical. I added a few more characters just in case I might end up using those ones, but for the most part, this is a very basic font that I only need for a very specific purpose, so I wasn't about to go through the trouble of making all of the glyphs for it. So one of the mistakes I made when I was putting this font together right at the beginning when I was converting it over is I didn't really space the characters out very well. Like, I mean, they have the proper spacing in them. That's why there's sort of a gap on the right and bottom sides of each character. But having them spaced apart not only makes it easier to figure out what their dimensions are when you start to load it up into whatever program you're using or whatever game engine you're using, but the other thing too is that having it spaced out like this also makes it so that you don't end up with characters clipping into each other. Like this, that's not normally something you have to worry about, but it's something I want to be careful about all the same. Something I haven't really touched on in terms of game design, or specifically in terms of game programming, is that when you're doing texture work, the textures tend to blend, the edges of what you're doing tend to blend with other things on the texture if you're doing any sort of scaling. So whenever I'm developing multiple things to put onto a single texture, I like them to be spaced apart so that there's no chance of them interfering with each other. Now I should point out that this is only a concern if you're doing any sort of scaling. If everything is going to be shown at a 1-to-1 pixel ratio, then you absolutely don't have to worry about this. Once I had the basic font figured out, I pulled it into Inkscape so that I could actually do a high-res version of it. This way I'll have nice and crisp lines and everything on all the diagonals and such, and it also allows me to do some things that would actually be pretty tricky if I was doing it in as pixel art form. And the other thing too is that doing it this way, well, I know I'm making a raster font, so I don't necessarily have to use Inkscape for this, but it all comes down to what's going to be fastest. Like that's my concern whenever I'm doing anything, is how can I shave time to make this as simply as I can? So putting together the font first in Deluxe Paint 2e was a lot faster to get just a basic idea of how I want it to look like, and then by pulling it into Inkscape and doing the high-res version here, I'm saving myself the hassle of having to make high-res changes if I'm not satisfied with how something is going. The other thing too with using Inkscape now is that I can do all kinds of things that I wouldn't be able to do if I was doing it as pixel art. For instance, with the N here, I was able to make it so that the line was the exact thickness in the middle and direction necessary in order for it to look proper. Like, this is not easy to do with pixel art. You'd have to do all kinds of shading between the different diagonal portions, and it just, if you don't do that, it looks really ugly. So this is the kind of thing where you absolutely want to be using like a vector program like this to make it look good. I also noticed that there was one particular glyph I forgot to make, and that's the copyright symbol. Now, it's really good idea to have a copyright symbol in your font when you're making your own custom font. Not because you're trying to copyright the font, but because you want to make sure that when you are trying to copyright something, you actually have a copyright symbol to use. See, one of the things they used to do in the old days of computing is that they'd put a C with 2 brackets on the side to indicate a copyright symbol, because the copyright symbol wasn't in the standard ASCII character sets. But the problem with doing that is that that's not actually a copyright symbol, so it doesn't actually count as copyright. So like, they usually would do that just to sort of indicate that the copyright does exist, not to indicate that that's the actual copyright being applied. So it's something to keep in mind. Like, that's fine if you've got like a physical product that actually has the real copyright on it, so that, you know, the copyright is indicated properly. But when you're working with something totally digital, you want to make sure you put the proper copyright symbol on your stuff. I mean, theoretically, you don't have to, because copyright is assumed by default in terms of whenever you make something artistic, but it's just a good idea to do it. And then the last thing I needed to do with the font is add in the lines. Yes, those separations that I was creating when I was doing the sort of concept shot stuff. I needed to put those lines in. And the reason why I didn't do it in the vector program is because that would have taken forever. And there's a very good reason why it would have taken forever. You see, when you're making a font, or when you're making any sort of graphics that are expected to be used in a 32-bit graphic environment, you kind of have to make sure that the background is transparent. See, if you were working on an old DOS game with 256 color graphics, you'd specifically assign one of the color palette entries to be your transparent color, so everything in that color would not be rendered. But when you're working with 32-bit software, you still have that option of doing color masking, but it interferes with doing any sort of anti-aliasing, and it also interferes with doing any sort of texture filtering. So the better thing to do is to use translucency and transparency by taking advantage of the alpha channel in your graphics. So making it so that I'd have those little separation lines in the high-res font in Inkscape would have been more of a hassle than just drawing them in, or more so erasing them from the actual finished bitmap that's going to be the texture file. In fact, when I was ready to do the final file here, I took away all the background stuff, tried to determine if I did everything correctly, and it looks like I didn't. There were a couple diagonal lines here that I was working on where I accidentally put black in instead of, or not so much black, but the transparent looking color, like the gray color, instead of actual translucency. So that's something I had to go back and fix so that this would look right when I actually came down to the final rendering of everything. And then here we are. The font is fully finished and ready to use. Well, sort of. We'll get to more details about implementing this font when we actually get into the programming side of things, because we still have to tell whatever program or game engine we're using where all the dimensions are for all the different glyphs. But that's something we'll get to in the future.